Hi, my name is Patrick Reagan. In Part 2, Understanding NTFS Permissions covers NTFS permissions, explicit permissions, inherited permissions, and effective permissions. It also discusses how to take ownership of a file or folder and how permissions are affected when you copy and move files from one place to another. As always, stick around for the practice questions at the end to test your knowledge and help you prepare for the A+ exam. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to click the like button. And if you have not already, subscribe to the Pet Has Your Back channel for more tech training content and technical know-how. The NTFS file permissions is a powerful mechanism used to control access to your files and folders, whether they're accessed across the network or by someone logging into the computer locally. These permissions are available on volumes formatted with the NTFS file system. To manage NTFS files, you can use the Windows File Explorer, as well as commands that can be executed at the command prompt in PowerShell. To see the Manage File and Folder permissions, right-click the file and folder, click Properties, and click the Security tab. The available standard NTFS permissions are Read and Execute, Write, Modify, List folder contents, and Full Control. The Read permission allows the user to read the contents of the folder or file. The Read and Execute permission allows the user to read the contents of the folder or file as well as execute a program. The Write program allows you to create files and folders and write to a file, while the Modify permissions allow you to read and write, delete files, and view contents. The List folder content only allows you to view a list of files in a folder. The Full Control permissions have all permissions, including adding, change, or removing permissions on the file and folders. Each of the standard permissions consists of a logical group of advanced permissions. To see the advanced permissions, right-click the file and folder, click Properties, and click the Security tab. Then, click Advanced button and click Add. After you selected Principal, the standard NTFS permissions are showing. To show the advanced NTFS permissions, click Show Advanced Permissions. To see a breakdown of the standard NTFS permissions to advanced permissions, visit the site shown on the screen. To simplify administration, you can use groups to grant permissions. By assigning NTFS permissions to a group, you're granting permissions to one or more people simultaneously, reducing the number of entries in each access list, as well as the amount of effort required to grant multiple people access to certain files or folders. If you have a group assigned to multiple folders, by adding a person to that group, the user will get all of the permissions granted to the group. There are two types of permissions used in NTFS. Explicit permissions are permissions granted directly to a file or folder. Inherited permissions are permissions that are granted to a folder, parent object or container that flow into the child object, such as subfolders or files inside the parent folder. In a file system, a folder with subfolders is considered the parent folder of the subfolders, while the subfolders are considered child folders. By default, after you set permissions on a parent folder, new files and subfolders that are created in the folder inherit those permissions. As you can see from the example on the screen, the Allow Full Control permission was granted or explicitly assigned on folder 1. By default, the Allow Full Control permissions will flow down to the subfolders in the files below folder 1. Therefore, folder 2, folder 3, and file 1, which is inside folder 3, inherit the Allow Full Control permission. If you grant different explicit permissions at a lower level, the lower level permissions take precedence. In this example, Allow Full Control permissions was granted on folder 1. The Allow Full Control permissions would normally flow down to folder 2. However, since the Read permission for the user or group was actually assigned or granted explicitly, that becomes the new permission for the folder 2, and that permission Allow Read will flow down to folder 3 and file 1. If a user has access to a file, he or she can still gain access to the file even if he or she does not have access to the folder containing the file. Of course, because the user doesn't have access to the folder, the user cannot navigate or browse through the folder to get to the file. Therefore, the user will have to know and use the Universal Naming Convention, or UNC, or local path to open the file. When you view permissions of a file or folder, they will appear in one of the following ways. Checked, which means permissions are explicitly assigned. Cleared or unchecked means no permissions are assigned. Shaded permissions are granted through inheritance from a parent folder. Besides granting the allow permission, you can also grant the deny permission. The deny permission always overrides other permissions that you have been granted, including when a user or group has been given full control. For example, if a group is granted read and write permission, and one person within the group is denied the write permission, the user's effective permission is the read permission. When you combine applying deny versus allowed with explicit versus inherited permissions, the hierarchy of precedence of permissions is as follows: explicit deny, explicit allow, inherited deny, and inherited allow. Because users can be a member of several groups, it's possible for them to have several sets of explicit permissions for a particular folder or file. When this occurs, their permissions are combined to form an effective permissions, which are actually permissions when logging in and accessing a file or folder. These consist of explicit permissions plus any inherited permissions. When you calculate effective permissions, you must first calculate the explicit and inherited permissions for an individual or group and then combine them. When combining user and group permissions for NTFS security, the effective permission is the commutative permission. The only exception is that deny permissions always apply. If you have a folder called data, in which you have folder 1, in which you have folder 2, in which you have folder 3, user 1 is a member of group 1 and 2. You assign explicitly: allow write permissions to the data folder to user 1, allow read permissions to folder 1 to group 1, and allow modify permissions to folder 2 to group 2. For user 1, specifically, data has the allow write permission explicitly given, which means that the write permissions will flow down to folder 1, folder 2, and file 1. Since group 1 had the allow read permission explicitly assigned to folder 1, for group 1, the allow read permissions will flow down to folder 2, which flows down to file 1. Since group 2 was assigned the allow modify permission to folder 2, for group 2, the allow modify permission will flow down to file 1. Now to calculate the effective permissions, which is cumulative. When you combine the user 1, group 1, and group 2 permissions, the effective permissions for user 1 is the allow write permissions for the data folder. For folder 1, the effective permission for user 1 is allow read and write. For folder 2, the effective permission for user 1 is allow write combined with allowed read combined with allow modify is allow modify. Remember, the allow modify includes the read and write permission. And lastly, for file 1, the effective permission for user 1 is calculated by combining the 3 permissions again. Therefore, it is the allow modify permission. Therefore, when user 1 logs in, the effective permission is that he or she will have allow write permissions to the data folder, allow read and write to folder 1. User 1 will also have allow modify permissions, which includes read and write for folder 2 and file 1. Let's look at another one. Again, user 1 is a member of group 1 and 2. You assign the following explicit permissions: the allow write permissions to the data folder to user 1, the allow read permissions to folder 1 to group 1, and the deny modify permissions to folder 2 to group 2. For user 1 NTFS permissions, allow write was explicitly granted to the data folder. That permission will flow down to folder 1, folder 2, and file 1. Group 1 is explicitly granted allowed read permissions to folder 1, which flows down to folder 2 in file 1. Lastly, group 2 is given the deny modify permission to folder 2, which flows down to file 1. When user 1 logs in, he or she will have the right permissions to the data folder. For folder 1, we have multiple permissions. Therefore, when we combine them, we will have allow read and write. For folder 2, it is a little bit different. There are 3 sets of permissions to apply: allow write and allow read, and deny modify. Remember, deny always wins out, even if your administrator are granted full control. Therefore, the deny modify wins, which includes deny read and write. Lastly, the same for file 1. When you combine the 3 permissions, the deny modify permission wins out. Therefore, when user 1 logs in, he or she will be able to write to the data folder and read and write to folder 1. However, user 1 will not be able to access folder 2 or file 1. In Windows, the Effective Access tab has been added to enable you to view the effective NTFS permissions for a user, group, or device account on a resource. To access this tab, right-click the file or folder, choose Properties, click the Security tab, and then click Advanced. Click the Effective Access Permissions tab as shown on the screen. Specify user or group and click the View Effective Access button. To stop inheritance of permissions to stop from flowing from the parent folder, you can open folder or file properties, click the Advanced button, click Disable Inheritance button, select the Replace All Child Object Permissions entries with inheritable permission entries from this object option. Select either Convert inherited permissions into explicit permissions on this object, or remove all inherited permissions from this object, and click OK. To enable inheritance, you just click the Enable Inheritance button. To view the permissions of a folder, right-click Folder 1 and click Properties. Then click the Security tab. As you can see, that Authenticated Users has inherited modify permissions, which includes read and execute, list folder contents, read and write permissions. When you click Group 1, Group 1 has explicitly granted the read and execute permissions, list folder contents, and read permissions. To explicitly grant permissions, click the Edit button and click the Add button, specify user or group, and then specify the permission you want to grant. To see the effective permissions, open the Properties, click the Security tab, click the Advanced button, and click the Effective Access tab. Then specify user group then click View Effective Access. To stop inheritance, first view the permissions granted to folder 1. Then move to folder 2 Properties, open Properties, select the Security tab, and click the Advanced button. To stop permissions from inheriting, click the Disable Inheritance button and select Convert Inheritance Permissions into Explicit Permissions on this object. Since the permissions were copied from above, which means the permissions were converted from inherited to explicit. You can then add or remove any users or groups at this level. If you're an administrator on a computer, you will have the take ownership right. The owner of the object controls how permissions are set on the object and who the permissions are granted. If for some reason access to the file or folder has been denied and the permission needs to be reset, take ownership of a file or folder and modify the permissions. To take ownership, you would right-click the folder or file and click Properties, click the Security tab and click the Advanced button. At the top of the Advanced Security Settings dialog box for the owner, click Change. In the Select User or Group dialog box, specify the group or user and click OK. Select the Replace an Owner on Subcontainers and Objects option. Select the Replace All Child Object Permissions Entries with Inheritable Permission Entries from this object option. Click OK. When you move a file or folder from an NTFS volume to a different NTFS volume, or copy a file or folder, it is treated as a new file or folder on the volume and will lose its original permissions and inherit the permissions of its new parent folder. Moving a file or folder on the same NTFS drive does not physically rewrite the data blocks on the disk. It just changes the directory pointer. Therefore, it retains the permissions and does not inherit the destination's folder's permissions. Question: which of the following NTFS security settings overrides all other settings? Answer: deny. Question: which minimum permission is needed to change permissions of a folder? Answer: full control. Question: what is the minimum permission needed to delete a file? Answer: modify. Question: you create a new folder and you want the folder to have different NTFS permissions than its parent folder. What should you change? Answer: inheritance. Question: which permission overwrites an inherited permission? Answer: explicit permission. Question: you have a folder on an NTFS volume. The administrators group was granted full control to the folder. You then grant the deny, write, and modify permissions to the folder to a user who's a member of the administrators group. What is the effective permissions for the user? Answer: none. Remember, the modify permission also allows for read and execute. Therefore, those will also be blocked. Question: the technician copies the secure file from drive C, that's an NTFS volume, to drive D. Both drives use the NTFS file system. What happens to the original file permissions on the newly copied file on drive D? Answer: the file inherits the permissions of the destination folder on drive D. Question: you move a file from the C:\folder A folder to the C:\folder B folder on the exact same NTFS formatted hard drive. What happens to the NTFS permissions of the file? Answer: the file retains its original permissions from the C:\/ folder A. For more information, visit these sites. In summary, the NTFS file permission tool is powerful and enables you to control access to your files and folders, whether they're accessed across the network or by someone logging on to the computer locally. To simplify administration, you can use groups to grant permissions. Explicit permissions are permissions granted directly to a file or folder. Inherited permissions are permissions that are granted to a folder, such as a parent object or container, that flow into the child objects, which are subfolders or files inside the parent folder. The denied permission always overrides other permissions that have been granted, including when a user or group has been given full control. When combining user and group permissions for NTFS security, the effective permission is the cumulative permission. If access to a file or folder has been denied and the permission needs to be reset, take ownership of a file or folder and modify the permissions. When you copy a file or folder, or move a file or folder from an NTFS volume to an NTFS different volume, is treated as a new file or folder on the volume and will lose its original permissions and inherits the permissions of its new parent folder. Moving a file or folder on the same NTFS drive does not physically rewrite the data blocks on the disk. It just changes the directory pointer. Therefore, it keeps the same permissions that it had before. Thank you for watching this video. The next video will be Windows Services Part 3, File Attributes, Compression, and EFS. If you like this video, click the like button. If you have not already, subscribe to the Pat Hatcherback channel. Thank you.